Greetings everyone, always lovely to have you with me. I wouldn't want to contemplate all this history alone, far less the workings of the human mind, all in pursuit of clues to what's happening here in the present day, desperate for insights, clues about how things might unfold in the future if we're not careful. Before we get started with today's episode of Hauntings, I just want to let you know how you can help support this channel in a practical way. Go to patreon.com, look for me by name, part with a bit of cash, sign up. It's about the price of a cup of coffee once a month. You become part of the family, you get early access to all my new content and exclusive access to a question and answer session that puts us together, brings us together. The details are down in the notes, or you could find it all on my website. Okay, it's time for a breathtaking landscape full of secrets. Lollards Church, I'm sure a lot of people know about this. It's fairly well documented. It's very well visited. It's a tourist attraction. It's a, what is it? it's a dark and slippery-sided wound, sliced, narrow and deep, fathoms deep, into a slab of millstone grit, bedrock, close by a village called Flash in Derbyshire. As I say, the geologists are of the opinion that there was some sort of geological event, some sort of tectonic movement, and a part of bedrock cracked away from the rest, leaving a very narrow ravine in between these two massive parts of the bedrock. And the passage, this narrow ravine, it's about 100 metres, 100 yards in length and 60 feet deep, but very narrow. It's quite claustrophobic, really. The sides of it, because of the absence of light, really, because it's effectively subterranean, really, and the sides are sort of dank and damp and dripping with natural water. And there's all sorts of mosses and the sort of plants that thrive in those sorts of locations. But it means that the sides of it are kind of like coloured like with verdigris. That sort of green that you get on a bronze statue that's been exposed to the elements for decades or centuries. And depending, I suppose, on your state of mind, wherever you go, there you are, as Buckaroo Banzai says. And whatever you kind of take into a place like that, in your imagination, in your subconscious, is what you'll find. So if you go into that place, I don't know, with a sense of darkness, with a sense of foreboding, then that's what you'll find. If you go in with a sense of something magical, in search of, glimpses of the fair folk or whatever, then that may well be what you find. So when you walk through it, when you pass into it, and as you're walking along, when you look up, you can see the sky, a narrow ribbon of sky directly above, although it's mostly overgrown. Trees growing at the top have spread their branches over it, so there's not really much sky to see. You're kind of looking up at as though it were roofed over like a tunnel. But it's the bedrock, it's the stuff of that part of Derbyshire. So you're looking at the stuff that underlies the surface of Derbyshire and North Staffordshire, Gradbach Hill, Ramshaw Rocks, the Roaches, all these local names for these places, as you would find it in some of the Middle English, rough knockled knars with norrid stones. Now that's that's a direct quote from Gawain and the Green Knight, but we'll get to that legend later. But the names, Gradbach Hill, Ramshaw Rocks, they're sort of rough sounding, rough as the millstone grit itself. And millstone grit is named because it was popular with millers for making their grindstones, for grinding grain. And so up above, up on the surface, if you like, it's, the sun shines, it's grouse moor, the wind blows, there's heather, it's wild and wuthering, it's open, it's the open air. But in Lollards Church, and Lollards Church is the name that's given to this ravine, it's just a perpetual gloom. It's kept cold. by geology. It's always cool down there because the light of daylight doesn't really penetrate very much. Certainly doesn't warm it up. From time to time, actually, a body of air moving through it from beginning to end is cooled by the feature, by the characteristics of Lud's Church. And so from time to time it kind of exhales cold air, so that if you stand at the end of it, you can feel this cold draft issuing from it. There's quite a magical atmosphere added to it by what grows on the walls. There's things that, ferns, silver hair, silver hair grass, as is liverwort, that kind of thing. Things that thrive in those kind of damp and slightly gloomy circumstances. And so I mentioned Gawain and the Green Knight. Scholars of Old English, Middle English literature have suggested that Lud's Church might have been the inspiration for the Green Chapel, which is one of the set-piece locations in the legend of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. It's a piece of work penned by someone, well, we know not who. There's no name attached to the original text of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, but the story might be familiar to, Tolkien purists and others with an interest in Middle English literature. Gawain is King Arthur's nephew, and also the youngest of the knights of the Round Table, that cast of characters that engage in various adventures. The Green Knight, literally green of flesh, green of armour, and mounted on a green horse, he turns up at Camelot on New Year's Eve, and he offers to play with the assembled company the beheading game, which is to say that he will stand and accept a blow from an axe. He'll take the first blow if whoever wields the axe will promise to visit him at his home, which is the Green Chapel, in a year and a day, and there accept a blow in return. Well, Gawain, youngest of the knights, steps forward and accepts the challenge. A single swing blow of his axe, he parts the knight from his head, and utterly unhurt, really unconcerned, the Green Knight just stoops and picks up his severed head, tucks it under his arm, says farewell, and leaves. And at that point, soon thereafter, Gawain embarks upon his quest. The Knights of the Round Table are always on quests, and he goes off to fulfil this promise to the Green Knight. And along the way, in the traditional fashion, his vows of chivalry and his vows of chastity are tested. And then he finally rocks up at the Green Chapel, as promised. This figure of the fact that he's green is obviously of deep significance, because by accepting the idea of this supernatural green-coloured entity, you're right there in the territory of the wild wood, the wild hunt, the green one. There are ancient legends of the Green One, who's a figure who kind of walks in the background. He's there, quite ambivalent through folklore and mythology. By some estimates, the Green One is an incarnation, a reincarnation of the prophet Elijah. So powerful in his way that even after dying the first time, keeps coming back to do his work, to influence society. And it's the role and it's the mission of the Green One to protect, even if they don't know it, people who have an important contribution to make to life, to the world. The Green One is there to enable that and to act as their protector. So any time you're confronted in folklore and mythology with a figure coloured green, you're obviously invited to contemplate something much bigger, something much deeper, a background colour for a representation of a time when human consciousness was more in tune with the spirit realm, the ghostly realm, the fair folk, the she of Irish mythology. That's the purview, that's the territory of the Green One. But to get back to Sir Gawain, he meets up with the Green Knight in the Green Church, and the Green Church, as it turns out, is essentially a great mound with a long passage inside it. So it's a bit like a whale and smithy that we were just talking about in the last episode. A subterranean passage, but on a colossal scale. To quote the poetry, and I'm going to butcher the Middle English here, about it he walks, debating with himself what he might. It had a hole in the end and on another side, and overgrown with grass and glodes anywhere, and all was hollow in with, nobbut an old cave or a crevice of an old crag. So you get Middle English, if you listen to it and look, I will never look at it, I don't know how to pronounce it, but you can catch glimpses of what becomes the language that we speak. You can sort of pick your way through it. And as I say, it's written in what's classified by students and professors of literature as Middle English. And more precisely, it's in a Midlands dialect that philologists, who are experts in the study of language, it's a dialect placed in the vicinity of Derbyshire, Cheshire, Staffordshire. So academics allow for at least the possibility that the anonymous poet who wrote Sir Gawain and the Green Knight came from Derbyshire, and that therefore he may well have been inspired by Lud's Church. He may have visited that place, known that place as part of his stamping ground, and incorporated it into the work. The knight is much bigger than the sum of his parts. He represents more. His is the colour of life itself, green, which means that he's sharing territory with those figures like Jack in the Green. That he is this embodiment of the living spirit of nature, of the older world, of something that we've all lost touch with. Something that's there in the background, that is nature, that is life itself. And for centuries during the medieval period, at the time of the equinox, which is to say the 2 days in the year when day and night are of equal length, equinox, the people would, especially the young people, would dress up in green costumes and cover themselves in moss and twigs and branches and whatever, in a conscious effort to manifest what was called the Moss Man. But there are two sides to it. Aren't there always? Green is also, depending on your point of view, the colour of evil. And we know this from countless references. Shakespeare kind of coined the idea of jealousy as the green-eyed monster in Othello. Green with envy. The devil is associated with the colour green. So his little witches and wizards, his servants. Green, obviously, is the instinctive colour that we apply to thoughts of serpents and dragons. And then during the Crusades, green took on even more dark associations when it was learned by the Crusaders, by the knights out in the Holy Land, that Muhammad's favourite colour was green. So obviously, for Christians, that was another negative association for that shade. Green, interestingly, chemically, you could say is a sort of a faithless, unreliable colour. When it comes to colouring of clothing, green is the first to fade. It's the first to discolour. It's hard to control it and keep it and fix it. And so green finds another way to become emblematic of being unpredictable or untrustworthy. And so it's everything that's unpredictable and untrustworthy in the cosmos. It's changeable. You turn your back on it and look again, and it's different. Back to the landscape of Lud's Church. Anyone descending from the daylight, from the hills above, where the Dane River runs and whatever, and down from there into the gloom of Lud's Church, you could be forgiven for feeling it's a place of ill will. As I say, depends on the mood that you're in, because whatever you take in yourself is what you'll find in a location. Sunlight's absent. We all talk about now that sunlight is antiseptic. That sunlight is like truth. It exposes what needs to be seen, and so there's no sunlight. There's darkness and gloom in Lud's Church. And as I mentioned anyway, the trees above have grown over the top, so there's almost a lid on it. And it's one of those places in the landscape where people are so affected by it that they want to leave something of themselves behind. Sometimes that's graffiti, obviously, but also there's a bit of a tradition there where people leave coins for as long as we've still got coins. People hammer coins into dead wood, into little cracks and splits and notches in the rock, which is evocative of and in conscious or unconscious memory of the sort of pagan rites of sacrifice. Mollifying the gods by leaving behind something of agreed value. There are also stories associating Lud's Church with the Druids. Long before Lud's Church was a church, with the kind of Christian religious connotation that we get from that word, it's associated with whatever it is that the Druids got up to. Druid is a word that's its etymology is complicated. It may come, the same sound may come from two different ideas, so that you end up with two words that sound the same but are slightly different. On the continent, it likely came from a source to do with the oak tree. It may be from knowledge of the oak tree. Druid becomes druid, the people who conduct some of their or all of their worship in association with oak trees. So that gives you druid. But it's possible, seems to be the case, that at the same time in, say, Ireland and in Irish Gaelic, it may have its roots in Darua, which would translate as, which would come down to us as the friends or the followers of the red god, Daruach, and the red god being manifest in the setting sun. So there was certainly sun worship. There's always sun worship. There's sun worship everywhere. It's probably the first entity that was worshipped by everyone everywhere. You're the supreme being. It's the brightest thing. It's the greatest thing. And it was finessed in the West, in Ireland, let's say, in the West where the sun sets, as the people who follow, the people who serve the red god, Darua. So they might be two slightly different things, but in any event, the Druids, whoever the Druids really were, whatever they stood for, whatever they meant, whatever they understood, that word, that sound of that word is associated with Lud's Church as well. It's possible on a more sort of prosaic level. I don't really buy this one, but it's very much part of what you'll hear in the vicinity of Lud's Church. So I'll give the devil his due. But it's supposed that it might be associated with a man, Walter de Ludoc, or de Ludac. There's various pronunciations of his name, but Lud is there at the beginning of his surname. And legend really has it that he was the leader of a Christian sect of Lollardy. Lollardy was one of the dissenting heretical forms of Christianity that was being one of the many alternative understandings of Christianity that was persecuted by, either by the Vatican Catholic Church or by the Anglican Church in England or whatever. But Lollardy was a way of worshipping Christ that was stamped upon. It was based, Lollardy comes out of the teachings of a 14th century, which is the 1300s, an English theologian and philosopher called John Wycliffe. And people who've heard of John Wycliffe at all will associate him with translating the Bible from Latin or Greek into the vernacular, in this case into English. And that was deeply frowned upon by, the aforementioned orthodoxy that wanted to control the liturgy and control scripture by keeping it in, sort of quasi-magical languages like Latin. And it was therefore, it was regarded as sinful and heretical to reduce the word of God to something as, workaday as the English language. But nonetheless, John Wycliffe had his followers, and he, as well as translating the Bible, he questioned, this was really where he got into trouble, he questioned the orthodoxy of the church. He didn't approve of the worship of saints. He thought that was pagan. He questioned the legitimacy of the papacy. Can you imagine? He challenged, the idea of the Pope. He was dismissive of the celibacy of priests. And he was also dismissive of transubstantiation, which is to say he questioned the idea that the bread and wine could be alchemically or magically or divinely converted into the blood and flesh of the living Christ. Questioned all of that. So he's a heretic, and his thinking and what he said was heretical, and everyone that followed him was condemned and persecuted. They didn't call themselves Lollards. It was a pejorative, really, that was applied to them by people who didn't like them. It came from a Dutch word. During the Black Death, which at that time in the 14th century was still in everyone's thoughts, there was a sort of a benighted brotherhood that took on the job of burying the dead, collecting the plague dead and dealing with them. And while they were going about their business, they chanted, they recited scripture, whatever, just softly under their breath. And lullen is the Dutch word for muttering. And Lollard was therefore a corruption of lollen, that people who didn't like them associated with the way they quoted scripture in the common tongue. They reduced the divinely inspired, the word of God. They corrupted it into English, and so anyone so doing was dismissed as a Lollard. There's a little book called Swithamley and Its Neighbourhood, Past and Present. It was written in the 19th century by a local landowner, Sir Philip Brocklehurst. He it is who penned the generally accepted version of what happened to the aforementioned Walter de Ludoc, or Ludank, or whatever his surname actually was, if he even existed. There's some dispute about whether this character is even real. But let's follow the story. He was said to have a congregation, a party of Lollards, just a few, that included his lovely 18-year-old niece and ward, who was called Alice. Her parents had died, and she was in his care. She was in her uncle's care, and she wherever he went, she went with him. About 14 of them, and they made the ravine their hiding place and their place of worship. They needed to be away from prying eyes. So hence Lud's church. He is Lud, and the place where he had his followers is Lud's church. While they were in there, they were sort of looked after in a bodyguard fashion by a local forester or master of the local woodland called Henry Monteer. He knew they were there. He kept their secret, and he provided them with food and water, and he looked after them while they were using Lud's church. The Lollard faith, by definition, was outcast, and so they couldn't meet in churches. They couldn't gather anywhere that was identifiable, and so they met in the open air. And the weather of the English climate being what it is, a place like Lud's church was ideal. It was somewhere sheltered, away from wind and rain, and out of sight of prying eyes. And during the summer months, according to the official version, they essentially lived there. They camped out in Lud's church so that they could they could go about their worshipful business. And so this was a process that went on for years. William de Lubbock and Alice and his followers, they were making use of this place in the Derbyshire countryside for years. And by the time of the dreadful day that makes Lud's church notorious, Walter de Lubbock was in his 70s, let's say, white-haired, but still vigorous, still strong, physically strong. And Alice was this 18-year-old beauty who was also blessed with a fine singing voice, which is very important for singing hymns and singing praise to God. But tragically, the beautiful notes of her musical voice were ultimately the undoing of the congregation. It's interesting, really, to contemplate that their time in the ravine is like a little air gap of something good and something well intentioned in a place that otherwise is associated with something dark and threatening. But while the Lollards were present there, it was sort of cleansed, if you like, by their presence. It gave it a different and a positive atmosphere. So anyway, they're in there on this given summer's day. They're in there. They've been worshipping, and they're now singing. But one by one, the Lollards they sense the approach of others, and one by one they stop singing until only Alice, who's sort of oblivious to what's going on around her, she continues to sing, and she's still singing when a party of soldiers burst upon them, because the soldiers, amongst other things, are tasked with hunting down heretics. So they come rushing into the ravine, and they have the Lollards cornered, and the commander shouts, "Yield in the name of the blessed church." Non-attendance at official church services was official Catholic services was regarded as a grievous wrong, a great moral failing, and any alternative worship, any deviation from the strictly applied orthodoxy of the church was illegal. It was forbidden. So all of this, it's important. I should probably have mentioned before, Lollardy was Protestantism before the Reformation. It was already a protest against the church, the Catholic Church, before the time of the Reformation. But John Wycliffe, who the Lollards followed, is regarded as like a star in the sky that heralds and foreshadows the coming of the Reformation. The coming of, it's Protestantism before the coming of the Reformation. So the soldiers burst in, got them cornered. Some of Walter's followers, they pick up muskets, they pick up weapons. Walter says no, and they drop them, and they're just standing there disarmed. But Henry Monteer, who's this giant of a man, becomes increasingly riled by the rough handling that the soldiers are inflicting on these, harmless followers of God, and he grabs one of the soldiers and flings him against the rest of them, and apparently they go down like skittles knocked over by a bowling ball, and chaos ensues. And it's in that fiery moment that one of the soldiers levels a primitive musket. At that time, it would have to have been something like an arquebus, which is a kind of a blunderbuss, wide-mouthed shotgun of a thing that fired, a grape shot of pellets. And he points it at Monteer and fires. But of course, the shots miss miss Monteer, and they hit Alice in the chest. and she drops, and she dies in Walter's arms. And in his horror and in his rage, Monteir sets about the men, and knocks them down one after another, and drives them back by just the force of his will and by the force of his temper. He drives them back to the entrance to Lud Church, but then he stops, because back from whence he came, he can hear the mournful sound of a final lament that's being sung by those Lollards in memory of the loss of their own, their finest flower, Alice, and all the heat goes out of him, and he comes back. And Walter, the soldiers are briefly chastened. The fact that they've killed this girl, it shocks even the soldiers, and they back off a little bit, and they let Walter carry Alice out of Lud's Church, out of the ravine, just to the entrance, and she's buried very quickly in a shallow grave. And they say their prayers, and then once all that's concluded and the soil is heaped on Alice's grave, all of them, even Monteir included, they surrender. They just give themselves up into the custody of the soldiers. Monteir, he would later escape from custody. He flees all the way to France and then returns to England and keeps fighting the good fight. There's an oak tree at the entrance to Lud Church, and many of the faithful will tell you that it's the natural marker for Alice's grave. And so now, when it comes to haunting, among the shadows of the ravine, it's the ghost of Alice that's said to roam, that's said to haunt Lud's Church more than any other presence. And some people who go, and some people who walk through, or some people who just stand at the entrance, they say they hear a beautiful voice, a woman's voice singing the notes carried on the wind. And this is the haunting of Lud's Church. Somewhere much later, around 1862, Brocklehurst, that aforementioned landowner who wrote the little guidebook that describes the plight of Walter and Alice and the rest of them, he installed into a niche in the ravine in Lud's Church a figurehead that had been scavenged from a shipwreck called Swithamley. The ship was called the Swithamley. It's long gone now. Time and dankness and wet and rot have seen to its disappearance. As I said, that's the sort of tourist board version of the origin of the name of Lud's Church, Walter and Alice. But it's a good story, but it's not the only story. And there are many others who say that Lud's Church refers to something else. There's an alternative etymology that traces it back to the mythical King Lud. King Lud features in the History of the Kings of Britain, penned by Geoffrey of Monmouth. King Lud, according to Geoffrey of Monmouth, is the monarch who founded London and is buried at Ludgate. Now, etymology is endlessly complicated. It's generally accepted that the origin of Ludgate is Old English Hulgat, which means the swinging gate, or a gate that opens on a hinge. But there's a hardcore that are faithful to the legend of King Lud, and they claim that as well as giving the origin of Ludgate and being the founder of London, it's also his name that's there in the ravine in Derbyshire. Lud, for fans of etymology and the rest, it may be the Welsh hero Lud Llaw Errant, which means Lud of the Silver Hand. And the legend of that Lud is of a warrior who loses his arm in battle and then has it replaced with a glittering prosthetic crafted by his brother, Dian Cecht. And that opens up that story there opens up a whole other world, connections to other places. That idea of the warrior losing his arm and having it replaced in one made of silver is there in the legend of the Tuatha De Danann. The Tuatha De Danann are the gods of early Irish mythology. They're like the first pre-human inhabitants of Ireland. And one of the great heroes of the Tuatha De Dan is Nuada, who's also called Nechten. And he loses a hand and a forearm in battle. And because he's now maimed, and the kings of the Tuatha De Dan had to be bodily perfect, had to be physically perfect, so you couldn't be a disabled king of the Tuatha De Danann. But he has his arm replaced with a silver prosthetic that's crafted by Irish mythology's version of Wayland. This a mythical metal worker. So all these stories swirling as in a mist, they've all got connections. They've all got relationships to one another. It's possible for people that are interested in these mythologies that all of these characters, like Lud, like Nuada, like Nechten, like the Tuatha De Danann, it's got its connections to the constellation Orion, which is easily the most recognisable constellation in the night sky. It even looks vaguely suggestive of what it's supposed to be. It even does seem to suggest the body, at least, of a warrior. And Orion, the arm that bears his club, which is the weapon that Orion, the huntsman, carries, is dipped into the Milky Way. And so the idea is that his hand is silvered by being dipped into the great celestial river of the Milky Way. So you've got this sort of father of all of that, this warrior in the sky and a silver arm. The stories they just swirl. They swirl like mist, and it means as I get, the longer I live and the older I get. When I was younger, I used to be so dismissive of all of this stuff. I used to think it was just whatever, hocus-pocus, mumbo-jumbo, but I don't think that anymore. I used to think there was history, and then there was everything else, and everything else was less. But I don't feel like that anymore. I'm much more open to the possibility that truth, whatever truth is just as much, if not more, to be distilled like flecks of gold from mythology. That it might be there. The Tuatha De Danann, the gods, the pre-human inhabitants of Ireland, they become, in that sort of evolutionary process down through the millennia and down through the centuries, they become the Sidhe, which is the fairies, the fair folk. They're kind of diminished. They start out as gods, the mightiest of the mighty, and then by a strange alchemy, they're rendered into something quite different, quite slight. And the Sidhe and the Tuatha De Dan, and whatever you think, they inhabit the other world, one word, other world. And the other world is accessed in Irish mythology via the passage graves of the Brunaboyne at Newgrange and all of the rest of it. So you can either find all of this so impossibly complicated and incestuous and intermixed as to be worth only dismissing, or you can, as I increasingly do, see it as a great reservoir of important thinking, big thinking, deep thinking that comes from something true. It comes from somewhere. So, back to Lud's Church. The stories there, I've said this over and over again, part of what fascinates me about this whole subject is the way certain places are thick with stories, thick with legends, different stories and different legends associated with them. Folklore and myth, it's not evenly spread like butter scraped over toast. It clumps. This interests me. Lud's Church is just one story after another. It all gathers there. Like some slow place in an otherwise fast-flowing river. There are places in the bends of rivers where everything gathers. All the flotsam and jetsam is in certain locations. And Lud's Church is one of those places where stories just seem to build up, like clouds of midges. There's even talk of Lud's Church being the stomping ground of a boggart, which is a kind of ghost that will be familiar to anyone who's watched the Harry Potter, J.K. Rowling cycle of books. A kind of a malevolent creature, really a product of English folklore, all about mischief and abduction of children. And Lud's Church, even in the sophistication of the 21st century, is still one of those places that captures the imagination. It's a natural wonder. Without a doubt, you'll be struck by it. It's one of those places that you would be impressed by if you saw it. And who knows what's really there? I mean, more and more, I think people take into these locations the contents of their own souls, and that sometimes, from time to time, that's made manifest in some kind of physical way. But they are the source of their own hauntings, one way or another. They're channeling something of themselves. And there are so many of these locations, special places, folded into the landscape. And where I am, I'm minded, because of Lud's Church, of a location close to where I live here in Stirlingshire. It's called Finnick Glen. It's every bit as hidden and mysterious as Lud's Church, and it's every bit as magical and captivating. It'll be known to people who've seen Outlander. You know, that time-travelling Scottish epic series. And Finnick Glen is a filming location. I think it's featured in Outlander more than once. It's a work of nature, again. It rather than an instantaneous event, you know, like a landslide, which is what created, or a tectonic geological event that created Lud's Church in an instant. Finnick Glen is a slower process. It was cut by the water of the Carnock Burn, and which still runs through Finnick Glen. And geologists will tell you that the Carnock Burn may, in the distant past, have been pressurised by the weight of glaciers of the ice age, and that as that great weight was pressing down, and as the climate was changing again and the ice was melting, that at the bottom, underneath that great weight of ice, the water was coming out at high pressure, and so was better able to cut the relatively soft rock that is the stuff of Finnick Glen. It's red sandstone. It's very beautiful. Again, the walls are green, high. It's very narrow, claustrophobically narrow. It's all lichen and whatever, the various species that are adapted to the damp and the gloom. And on account of the sandstone, the water of Carnock Burn, as it goes through, shallow, the water's shallow going through the glen. It's stained red. It's like blood. It's very atmospheric. And there's an outcrop of bedrock that's worn and sort of tortured by by eons of water. And it kind of looks to me like a mushroom. It's got that kind of shape, but it's maybe a hat, and it's called the Devil's Pulpit. Well, wouldn't it be? And it's claimed by some that from time to time the devil preaches from the Devil's Pulpit to whoever gathers to hear him. Another one. I mean, I mentioned Nechtan in the context of the Tuatha De Danann and Nuada, who was their first king, I think. And Nuada is also called Nechtan. And St Nechtan's Glen is a place that I'm familiar with and I've written about in other contexts. And it's by Trethevy in Cornwall. This one cut by the Travillet River. And it's fantastic. It was a 60-foot waterfall, delicate as silver jewellery. Sort of leaps from on high and falls and fills a shallow bowl, a bowl of bedrock. It's stunningly beautiful, and visitors go there, especially in times of trial and trauma and hurt. People go there and they leave little offerings, photographs of loved ones, children's toys, crystals on threads, coloured ribbons tied around twigs, and it's where people go, possibly with a sick relative or a sick child, and they go there and they offer up prayers, and people take those thoughts to places like St Nechtan's Glen, places like Lud's Church, places like Finnick Glen. I'm not making a direct connection, I should say, between Saint Nechtan and Nechtan of the Tuatha De Danann, but the coincidence is just is just of interest to me. That in a similar place, there's a connection to a figure with a similar name. It depends who you think the Necton of Necton's Glen actually is. But, I think the abiding sense is that Lud's Church is a place associated with badness. It's a place associated with heartbreak, maybe even a place associated with evil, or the evil that men do. And for our generations, really, that all has as its centre, its bleeding heart, Alice de Lud Och. Her death, her loss is what, in the modern era continues to taint the place as having been made dark by wickedness, by a sin. There's other aspects to the supernatural atmosphere of Lud's Church. People walking through now report drifting lights, like ball lightning, that kind of phenomena. Ghost lights, if you like, these sort of amorphous, luminous shapes that appear and disappear, will-o'-the-wisps. Now, Lud's Church is associated with that phenomenon. And there's a British author that I stumbled upon when I was doing background reading around Lud's Church, a British author called Paul Devereux, and he has written about, he particularly calls them earth lights, and he has coined that term because he believes that in locations where the Earth's crust, the rock of the tectonic plates, is stressed and strained, that it manifests in the air above. It's actually called tectonic strain theory. And the idea is that where there has been or is ongoing seismic activity, even where it's undetectable, you can't hear it or see it or feel it, but there's stress. The rock is somehow under pressure that it could create in the atmosphere above ball lightning. And descriptions, manifestations of lights in the air, lights in the sky, are not new. Paul Devereux has written, "Earthlights are or were known to traditional and ancient peoples. They were fairies to the Irish and other Celtic peoples, although also harbingers of death, known as corpse candles to the Welsh, the disembodied heads of women who had died in childbirth to Malaysians, bodhisattvas to Chinese or Tibetan Buddhists who built temples where such sightings occurred." Bodhisattvas are within Buddhism, that's the people that they have achieved nirvana. They are awake. They have Buddha mind, and they could get themselves off the hamster wheel of reincarnation and go into that unbecoming, that undoing that is nirvana. But they choose to come back. They choose to come back to this dimension, bodhisattvas, to help. They come back to help others who are still on the hamster wheel to progress, to progress. And so bodhisattvas are the most revered, and temples are raised in their honour. But bodhisattvas are in the presence thereof, and the temples raised to them are associated with these lights, these manifestations. And so, to get right down to it, because Lud's Church was created by a break, a geological event, it's reasonable to entertain the thought of tectonic strain theory and to allow for the possibility that there's ongoing, undetectable geological activity that's in some way not fully understood is causing these lights that people see. Paul Devereux also, he describes it otherwise as ancestor lights, suggesting that there might be a connection between those lights and those that went before, that there's something emanating from the ancestors, the thought of the ancestors, the collective memory of the ancestors, that if enough people are thinking about the same idea determinedly enough, that it manifests, that the thought of many people in concert manifests, like the Marianne apparitions. If the geology under stress creates the lights, people under stress all at the same time. Their stress might manifest as something that's visible or palpable. These are all conversations that are surely worth having. I love the idea of, I said that worship of the sun is a fundamental, and understandably, you couldn't fail to be impressed by the sun, even if you didn't know what it was. So sun worship and worship of the light is an obvious. I mean, the earliest Christian chapels had so much in common with the early passage graves, the Wayland's Smithy, New Grange type places. Those mounds were always aligned on positions of the sun at given times of the year, often the shortest day or the longest day or whatever. And they were structured such that light would, on a given day, the light of the sun, which may have been the focus of worship, would creep up a passageway and illuminate something inside, so that it would be a magical transformation of a return of the life that the sun represented. And the earliest Christian chapels that sought to replace that religion, that older religion, they were essentially the same. Churches are always aligned, east to west, and they're usually aligned where east lies on the day of the saint with which that particular church is associated. But again, the idea is the same, that the light of the sun enters the space within and illuminates it. It's the same thing. And so these traditions are so old, and ancestor worship is as old. People used to revere the people that had gone before, generation after generation into the past. And that sense of connection, that desire to connect with the ancestors is all around us all the time. Years ago, I went hunting for ancestors, not my own, but ancestors of Vikings. I did a whole series and wrote a book about who the Vikings were, where they came from, what they did, and there's an origin story for some of them on a tiny island called Faro, which is off the northern tip of Gotland in the Baltic. And I was on Faro, and I was taken by a local archaeologist called Joachim Wellen to look for 4,000-year-old art carved into the bedrock in a remote location. And what we were looking for were etchings of ships or seagoing vessels used by seagoing people thousands of years before any Scandinavian ever thought of going a Viking. This was a seagoing, adventurous tradition that was, by orders of magnitude older than Vikings. And so we went out into this middle of nowhere place in the depths of winter on a day when this we were losing the light very rapidly, and we found the petroglyphs. We found them. I found them actually. I stumbled across them on a horizontal slab of bedrock, and the sun was low, which actually helped because the sunlight was coming in at an angle, and it was casting the requisite shadows that sort of revealed these carvings. And they were underneath frozen water. It was like I don't know, maybe an inch of ice, as clear as window glass, frozen across the top of them. All of it making it more spectacular, really. And there were these simple etchings. It was like a dish shape, a shallow dish which represented the vessel, and then a dozen or so vertical strokes that represented the crew, the oarsmen. And it was magical, that way in which we were physically separated from them by this window of ice. And we were also separated from them in time. We were thousands of years separated from them. But nonetheless, the artist was there in what he had manifest, in what he had left behind. And the meaning of it was still palpable after all of that time, even although they were out of reach, gone in every way. And I realise now that my interest in archaeology when I was a teenager, that took me to university at that time, I didn't really think about it at the time, but I know now that what made it magical for me, amongst other things, was that the possibility to catch glimpses in the modern world of what ancient people had intended. Those petroglyphs were fossilised thoughts. That's the way somebody was thinking 4,000 years ago. And the thought's still there. I find that magical. I've talked before about the mother and baby buried it together at Vedbeck, outside Copenhagen. Mesolithic, 7,000 years old, mother and a newborn baby, died together in childbirth, buried together with great ceremony, found by chance. And it's absolutely the case that as archaeologists, the archaeologists that excavated it, they excavated grief, as well as the bones and the various trinkets that were left behind by people to whom that mother and baby mattered. Their grief was there too. It was made manifest in the efforts that they had gone to honour this couple, these two souls. And it's still palpable all those thousands of years later. So it invites you to ask, what do you mean by haunting? What do you mean by ghosts? Because if you stand in the presence of that grave, or in the case of that rock art on Faro, where you're in the presence of the thought of an individual from 4,000 years ago, what do you mean by ghost? So there you go, Lud's Church. It's let's say it is haunted by poor doomed Alice, but it's also, I would say, haunted by the ghosts of all who have passed through it. Talked about Rudyard Kipling's Puck of Pook's Hill. This narrator of a story who says he's the oldest thing in England, and he's seen them all come and he's seen them all go. He's seen the different lifestyles and lives that were lived and are lived no longer. I would say that a place like Lud's Church is undeniably haunted by everyone that's been through it. Ice Age hunters who would have been through it. They'd have used it as a shortcut from somewhere to elsewhere, or they'd have used it for shelter. What they made of it is anybody's guess. Were they haunted by it? Did they tell stories about it? And then the farmers on their way to the fertile uplands, the Druids, whoever they were, the Lollards, and everyone else before, during and after. It's the Rock of Ages, Lud's Church, cleft for them. And many people going through it will have been struck by it, moved by it, affected by it, and would have remained haunted by it. And it seems perfectly reasonable to me to suggest that the residue of their emotions is there, snagged like sheep's fleece on a nail. I think that whenever any of us pauses in a place like that and thinks like that, we're connected to all of it and all of them.